The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome back. I'm Nick Adamson, Assistant Professor of Asian Studies, and tonight we're very pleased to welcome Charlotte Brooks to the Cornell Contemporary China Initiative. Dr. Brooks is a professor of history at Baruch College who specializes in Asian American history, and she's the author of many articles in three very important books, one of which is on Asian American housing in urban California. One's called Between Mao and McCarthy, Chinese American Politics in the Cold War Years. Useful if you're thinking about your parents' politics and why they think what they think, if you're Asian American. And a forthcoming book titled American Exodus, Second Generation Chinese Americans in China, which looks at Chinese Americans who returned to China in the first half of the 20th century, and which I think will probably be the foundation for today's lecture on modern and contemporary Chinese citizenship politics and policies. We're extremely lucky to have received a slice of Professor Brooks' time and attention. I'm very happy to have her here, so let's welcome her to the CCCI.
Thank you. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about the citizen status of foreign-born ethnic Chinese in China. And as Nick mentioned, I became interested in this issue while doing research for the book that I'm publishing this summer called American Exodus, about second-generation Chinese-American citizens who moved to China in the late Qing and Republican era. And the book deals with people who were born in the United States at a time when Chinese who immigrated to the United States, even those few who could come to the US, could not become citizens. But many of their children actually moved to China for careers and education. And while I was finishing this book, in 2016, 2017, I read two items that reminded me of the research I'd done for the book in some ways. The first item, I don't remember how I came upon it, but it was on the China Power blog of The Diplomat. It's an online kind of magazine, and it was written by a guy named Cal Wong, and he reported that, quote, late last month, two teenagers born and raised in Canada were denied 10-year visas to China based on the fact that their parents were born in Hong Kong. Perhaps more alarmingly for the hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers who have fled to the safe harbor of Canada and other democracy-friendly nations, the teens were told that they must travel to China as Chinese nationals. And these are not Hong Kong-born people, these are Canadian-born. Wong also noted that he had had the same issue. He was born in Hong Kong, naturalized in Australia, and had been told he needed to travel into China if he were to travel there as a Chinese national. And this, as it turned out, was not a fluke. I did a little more research and discovered that it's such a common issue now that Canada currently promises to extend consular recognition to any Chinese Canadian who enters China under these circumstances. The second story I noticed that reminded me of my research was reported in late 2018, and some of you may actually be familiar with. It concerned Victor Liu. Victor Liu was an American citizen by birth, and his sister Cynthia was a naturalized U.S. citizen. They're currently being held in China on an exit ban to force their apparently estranged father, a Chinese citizen accused of financial crimes, to surrender himself to PRC authorities. Again, enough U.S. citizens have encountered exit bans in China that the U.S. State Department in early 2018 issued a warning for the People's Republic of China and reaffirmed it this January. And you can see this is actually just a screenshot of the China Travel Advisory currently on the State Department China page. And basically, exit bans can be used against anyone. They're not actually they don't conform to international law. They violate international law, but they can be used against anyone in the PRC, has used them against numerous business people. But one part of the State Department warning specifically notes that, quote, U.S. Chinese citizens and U.S. citizens of Chinese heritage may be subject to additional scrutiny and harassment, and China may prevent the U.S. Embassy from providing consular services, unquote. Now, neither of these stories dealt with those I'd heard of being targeted on the mainland. Basically, China-born people who had naturalized abroad, but then used their Chinese travel documents or passports to enter China and do business. China does not recognize dual citizenship. Instead, the Victor Liu case in particular, and the ones that Cal Wong described of the Chinese-Canadian teenagers, they involve variations in some way, the PRC asserting an unusual degree of authority over foreign-born ethnic Chinese, in part because of their ethnicity, it seems. And this is why these news items interested me so much, because stories like that made me wonder about the degree to which the People's Republic of China was sliding towards the approach to citizenship and the status of ethnic Chinese born abroad that its predecessor regimes did in the first half of the 20th century, and that I encountered a number of times when I was doing the research for my book. So as a historian, this similarity interests me, but not because I believe the stale cliche that history repeats itself. Like almost every historian, I not only reject this idea, but I'm actually perplexed at the longevity of a phrase with very little meaning and even less truth. And I had this discussion, I've had this discussion with numerous people I know about their professions and these sort of assumptions people have. And there seems to be at least one misbegotten assumption for every profession. Lawyers will tell you that the idea that possession is 9/10 of the law is completely false, and yet people will always claim that this is somehow a truth. And I'm betting that a lot of doctors are kind of tired these days of hearing about how an apple a day will keep them away, since really they'd rather just have you get a measles vaccine, right? So there are all kinds of assumptions that people have about history. And as a historian, I know that, in fact, contingent events matter in every instance, that contexts change, that learning from history's mistakes, which is another favorite cliche, this assumes actual agreement about mistakes and some kind of unified history, neither of which we have. And then historical analogies are often meaningless or worse. So instead, as a historian thinking about what the treatment of ethnic Chinese citizens in Republican-era China might tell us about the current People's Republic of China, I wonder first if the assumed similarity that the surface similarity is real, and second, if it is, why might the PRC be adopting the policies of predecessors it claims to reject, especially since it's operating in a world that's fundamentally different from the one in which those predecessors operated? So to try to answer these questions, I'm going to go back in time at the beginning and then sort of move up, explain the older context, and then move forward in time and try to understand the aims of the PRC's current policies on foreign-born ethnic Chinese in China, as well as naturalized ethnic Chinese in China with foreign citizenship. So I'm going to go back to the past where I honestly feel much more comfortable. And I'm going to talk a little bit first about the most recent predecessor regime, which was the Chinese nationalist government, the Chinese nationalists, or the Kuomintang Party. And they were heirs to a legal definition of Chinese citizenship that they did not, in fact, themselves develop. The sort of more 20th century concept of Chinese citizenship was first developed in 1909, the very twilight of the Qing dynasty. And in the Nationality Law that the Qing dynasty promulgated that year, the imperial government stated that any child, wherever born, was a Chinese subject if his or her father was Chinese. And what this essentially meant was that all ethnic Chinese born abroad were considered by the Qing government to be Chinese subjects. However they thought of themselves, it didn't matter if they had a Chinese father. And this law was adopted by the regimes that followed the Qing dynasty, the early Republican regimes, and the Kuomintang government not only accepted it, but also strengthened it and built upon it. So even more than the previous regimes, the Kuomintang, the nationalists, also embraced and deployed the term Huaqiao, which we generally translate, and I've done so up here, as overseas Chinese. And they use this in their propaganda and their policy. And this term itself dates to the late 19th century, and in its most narrow and politicized reading, it suggests ties of loyalty to China, to the Chinese motherland, often is how the translation is made. And this assumes ties even among ethnic Chinese born and raised elsewhere. So Hua Qiao implies as well that the people we call overseas Chinese were largely sojourning abroad before returning to their true home, China. Yet the term itself and its context is very complex because, in fact, many people used it and use it simply to mean ethnic Chinese living abroad, wherever their ties of loyalty may lie. And I'm guilty of this myself. I've done this in my own work with qualifications because there's really no better term than overseas Chinese in many cases to describe the people I'm writing about in the Republican era, partly because these people use the term themselves, even those who many of them spoke only English or not much Cantonese, and they used Hua Qiao or overseas Chinese to describe themselves with no sense of it having a tie of loyalty. But when the nationalists used the term Hua Qiao, they meant it in its narrowest, most tied to China meaning. And the nationalists' approach to those they termed the Hua Qiao reflected a kind of approach to citizenship found in many nations in the world at this time, in the pre-World War II years, and even now. And the term that we use for this approach to citizenship is called jus sanguinis, and I apologize to anybody who's an actual legal scholar or took Latin. As a historian, I just sort of have to make do with what my lawyer friends tell me is the correct pronunciation. But jus sanguinis means right of blood. And jus sanguinis ties citizenship to ethnicity and parentage. And this is quite different from the American approach to citizenship known as jus soli, or right of soil. In other words, if you're born in the United States on US soil, you are an American citizenship. There is, of course, some overlap and fuzziness there. For instance, Americans who give birth abroad but register their children with their local consul or embassy of the United States, this is seen as conveying their American citizenship to their children. But the most well-known aspect of American jus soli is the aspect of birth on U.S. soil conveying citizenship, what has become known in recent years as birthright citizenship. And this right was clearly affirmed by the Supreme Court in a Supreme Court case in 1898. And not coincidentally, that Supreme Court case dealt with a Chinese American. And this Chinese American's name was Wong Kim Ark. He had been born in San Francisco, traveled to China like many young Chinese Americans did, and when he returned, the really it was not even sort of our what we think of as immigration officials. It was probably the collector of the port who denied him entry and said that because his parents were Chinese immigrants who were under U.S. law considered racially ineligible for citizenship, he himself was actually not an American citizen. And so Wong Kim Ark took this all the way to the Supreme Court, which in 1898 reaffirmed that the 14th Amendment applied to everybody, and that Wong Kim Ark, regardless of his parents' status, was an American citizen. And I should add that Chinese immigrants could not naturalize in the United States until 1943 during World War II. So Chinese American citizens until 1943 were almost entirely people born on U.S. soil, with a few handfuls of people who had moved to Hawaii before it was annexed by the United States or fought in World War I. So the divergence of jus soli and jus sanguinis concepts of citizenship created a number of problems in China in the years before World War II, because hundreds and eventually thousands of Chinese American citizens, along with significant numbers of Chinese Canadians, British subjects, and British protected persons from all kinds of parts of Southeast Asia, Hong Kong as well as Chinese Australians, Chinese Filipinos, and many other people who had some claim to a status other than being born in China, some claim to some other citizens or subject status. Hundreds and then thousands of these people came to work and study in China. Many of them, the Americans among them, often parlayed their Western educations and foreign language ability into careers in China's developing coastal cities like Shanghai, especially those like Shanghai that were under foreign control or had sort of semi-Westernized sectors. And this is actually a map for those of you, since this is more of a contemporary class, I understand in a Contemporary China Initiative lecture series. This is a map of parts of China that were part of the unequal treaties of this time that China had lost actual control over certain parts of its own territory, usually pieces of various Chinese cities that were known as concessions or settlements, and there were many of them. And it was in these in-between areas, actually, places controlled by foreigners, but in Chinese spaces, that many ethnic Chinese from abroad came to work and study. So that was one aspect of this, but many foreigners in China before World War II benefited from another aspect of the unequal treaties of this time. And this was something called extraterritoriality, which many foreigners shortened to extrality, and I will too, because otherwise I'll trip over this word continually. Extrality was a system that the Western powers imposed on China beginning in the mid-19th century. And it meant that if a foreigner was accused of committing a crime in China, Chinese officials had to hand him or her over to representatives of his or her nation for trial. Sometimes this meant that the foreigner was sent back to his or her homeland for trial under that nation's laws. But many other times, these people were actually tried inside China itself, but under their own laws by jurists from their own countries. And we often forget that actually until 1941, there was a U.S. court for China, in China, that was American judges, that were hearing trials of American citizens accused of committing crimes in China, or some cases that involved American citizens in some way. And so maybe you can see at this point why the question interested me of Chinese American citizens' supposed dual citizenship inside China, and why in China it became so fraught over time. Essentially, foreign-born ethnic Chinese were considered Chinese citizens by Republican Chinese governments, including the nationalist regime, which took power in 1927 in many places. But these same people could claim extrality based on their foreign citizenship. By the mid-1920s, in fact, the U.S. consulates in China, especially in Guangzhou, were bulging with their files, their case files were bulging with Chinese-American cases involving Chinese-American citizens charged with some offense or other by a Chinese warlord government or a nationalist court, and in which the U.S. consular staff in that jurisdiction had gotten involved because Chinese Americans claimed extrality, that they were not actually subject to Chinese law. For Chinese Americans, their special dual status essentially ended in 1926 after a case involving a young man named Chu Xiao-y. I don't actually know how he pronounced his name in Cantonese. This was the way he spelled it. It's Jiao Shihui in Pinyin Mandarin, but that's, I'm sure, not how he ever used the terms. So he was actually born, the young man at the top here, he was born in Manhattan, New York. He was raised there, mostly educated in schools in lower Manhattan, and then a little bit in Chicago, where his family also lived for a time. In his mid-teenage years, he went to Guangzhou. So in 1921, he traveled to Guangzhou to study for possible entrance to a Chinese university. Poor Chu Xiao-y had the misfortune, in a sense, to share the family home in Guangzhou with a half-brother, a China-born journalist at the bottom here, who spelled his name in English, Chu Xiao-y. Chu Xiao-y was a conservative activist in Chinese politics, a member of the Kuomintang at the time of the First United Front in Guangzhou, which was in the mid-1920s. This is a time when the nationalist government in the South was allied with the Chinese communists, trying to build an army and a government to unify warlord-divided China. Now, Chu Xiao-y was a conservative, in other words, at a time when Guangzhou was becoming more and more radical and the Kuomintang was becoming more and more radical. And in 1925, the leftist Kuomintang leader, Liao Zhengkai, was assassinated. And people don't really remember Liao Zhengkai anymore, unless you know anything about Chinese history from that particular period. But Liao was one of the three kind of heir apparents of Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen died of cancer just a few months earlier in 1925. So Liao Zhengkai was assassinated in 1925, just a little bit after Sun Yat-sen's death. Guangzhou is already in turmoil. And what happens is that leftist cadets basically arrive at the door of the Chu family home in Guangzhou. They're there to arrest Chu Xiao-y. There's really not any evidence that Chu Xiao-y himself was involved in the assassination, but he was a conservative and he was unpopular with the leftist cadets, and they wanted to arrest him in connection with the murder. He had wisely absented himself. He had fled. And so the cadets just arrested his half-brother, Chu Xiao-y, who was at that point 22. Didn't speak Chinese all that well, certainly didn't read and write it all that well yet. And the cadets accused the younger Chu of being involved in the assassination of Liao Zhengkai. They also accused him of swindling the government. They claimed that he was involved in numerous other crimes, pretty ambitious for a kid, but of course these were all Chu Xiao-y's crimes, and because Chu Xiao-y was nowhere to be found, Chu Xiao-y had to do. And so they arrested him, and he sat in jail for months and months, terrified for his life. He was, again, 22 years old. The cadets also occupied that family's home. It forced Chu's mother and young sisters to flee to Hong Kong, and his two Manhattan-born brothers pled with the U.S. consul to do something for their brother. He was an American citizen. He had the right of extraterritoriality. He should not even be in jail at all, they claimed. And because of the racism ascendant in the State Department at this time, and the desire that many consular officials in Guangzhou had to preserve extraterritoriality for white Americans in China at a time of government turmoil and upheaval in China, basically the U.S. consul in Guangzhou was he had a dilemma. He believed that the nationalists might eventually rule China, or at least large parts of the South. He knew that the nationalists saw extraterritoriality as a terrible thing for China's sovereignty and China's future and wanted to get rid of it. But the U.S. consul, a guy named Douglas Jenkins, also believed that it was in America's interest to preserve extraterritoriality. And so he had to make some concession, he felt, to the nationalists in Guangzhou. And the status of Chinese Americans were the concession he decided to make. It was the easiest thing to do, and it really matched the sort of racial outlook of the State Department at this time. And so what Chu's case became is it became the precedent that the U.S. consulate and the State Department used for withdrawing protection from Chinese American dual citizens in China. This scored points with the nationalist government. It showed that America respected the nationalists in the South, but it also allowed the consul to protect extraterritoriality for white Americans. Now, the State Department, and here's actually, I'm not sure how good a visual it is, but it's the memo I found. It's kind of a stunning memo to read. The State Department said that it was simply abiding by international law by denying Chu Xiao-y extraterritoriality. And under international law at the time, in the 1920s, dual citizens who lived in one of the two nations that they were citizens of were subject to the authority of the nation in which they lived at that moment, unless a treaty existed between those two nations specifying otherwise. The United States government had actually encountered the same problem with many immigrant groups and had made separate treaties with Germany and with France to give U.S. citizens who were born in the U.S. soil of French parents and German parents, people who were seen as white in America at this time, to preserve their U.S. citizenship. But no such treaty was even imagined with China. There was no will for it in the State Department. And so the State Department said that extraterritoriality did not really apply to Chu Xiao-y because he was living in China and they had authority. The Chinese government had authority. But the State Department claimed Chinese Americans who wished to be regarded as U.S. citizens while in China simply needed to denaturalize or denationalize. They use these terms often interchangeably. In essence, they just needed to give up their Chinese citizenship formally. The nationalist government, as the U.S. government well knew, offered no way for Chinese American citizens to denaturalize or denationalize. There was actually no procedure for them to be able to do this. So the U.S. government is saying they just need to do this simple procedure, which actually did not exist at the time and did not really exist for many people all the way through the 1930s. And the reason I put up this this memo is it does show sort of the way that racial nationalism was determining and cultural ideas were determining State Department policy, which the State Department claimed was based on international law, but in fact was based on cultural ideas. Chu Xiao-y has many Chinese relatives and was living as a Chinese. It's stunning that somebody who is Chinese American might have Chinese relatives. And the term, it's not really stunning, but also living as a Chinese is such a vague, sort of meaningless formulation. So after 1926, Chinese Americans who wished to enjoy extrality rights simply could not do so in China. The only place that the new US policy on Chinese American citizenship did not operate was in Shanghai. And this is a map of Shanghai from 1904, but it didn't really, the areas that that are shown in the map don't really change. They actually expand a little. By the 1920s. This is actually a map of Shanghai's foreign-controlled areas, the international settlement, which was policed and governed by the Shanghai Municipal Council, a foreign, a really elected body of foreigners, elected by foreign, what were called ratepayers in Shanghai. And then there's also part of this is the French concession, which was governed by France, or local French authorities. And I like that there's actually a Chinese city in Shanghai, which is itself a Chinese city, at the bottom of the map. So Shanghai was the only place where Chinese American citizens enjoyed extrality rights. And that's because, of course, they enjoyed them only inside the areas of Shanghai that were under foreign control, not Chinese government control. And these were the areas that, in fact, the Western powers had forced the Chinese to concede to Western control during the 19th century. But even in Shanghai, this is actually a picture of Shanghai in the 20s to give you a sense of, this is a sort of a bustling modern city in which really hundreds of Chinese Americans made their homes, often working as professionals, doctors, lawyers, the kinds of jobs they could not imagine having in the United States because of job discrimination and racism. So in Shanghai, the overlapping jurisdictions and borders eventually created their own problems for Chinese American citizenship rights. In 1929, an American lawyer, born in Hawaii, educated of all places in Nebraska, a veteran of World War I, a member of the American Legion, this man, YUN Nicholas Char, and several friends from his baseball team, and he was a big sportsman. He founded a football team, a baseball team, any sport that was American, he played in Shanghai. He also liked polo, apparently. So he and members of his baseball team got into a fight with some Chinese citizens who were trying to use the same playing field in the French concession. And apparently what happened is Nick Char took his baseball bat and cracked one of these guys in the fight over the head with a baseball bat, which is a pretty tough kind of wound to give somebody. So the man who was injured took Char to court. He claimed that Char had badly injured him, but the Chinese police couldn't arrest Nick Char because Nick Char lived and worked in the foreign-controlled concession area as a partner in an American law firm. However, a nationalist official who supposedly was Nick Char's good friend tricked him into leaving the concession to discuss a case. When he arrived at the Chinese official's office, the police arrived with him and captured him and put him in jail. And he was put on trial and found guilty under Chinese law. At this point, the Hawaiian-born Char claimed extrality. He said, I'm an American citizen, and I'm not, I can't be tried under Chinese law or in a Chinese court. In response, Chinese officials contended that extrality did not extend to Nick Char because under international law, he, as a dual citizen, was actually a Chinese citizen. They further made their point by pointing out that Nick Char had practiced law in the Chinese Provisional Court, a privilege denied to foreigners. And he did so by fudging, using this term that in Chinese, and I forget the exact term, that talks about nativity rather than actual birthplace, and giving his native place as Zhongshan. So upon hearing the second part, that he had practiced law in a Chinese court, which was actually not something foreigners could do under Chinese law, the already reluctant American consular officials abandoned their tepid defense of Nick Char, who spent the next 2 months in a Shanghai prison cell. Now, the Nick Char case shows, among other things, I like it because it shows how Chinese American citizens in China could and did attempt to use their Chinese identity while benefiting from their U.S. citizenship status. And why did they do this? Well, racism pushed them to seek decent work in China. And once there, dual citizenship provided potential protection and a competitive edge. And in fact, the phenomenon of passing as a purely Chinese citizen unless you got in trouble and then pointing out that you were a foreign subject, this was not at all limited to American Chinese, but was actually a common practice among many different so-called overseas Chinese, especially those born in Southeast Asia's European colonies. Well, beginning in 1941, the pre-war citizenship and extrality system collapsed with the outbreak of the Pacific War. Extrality ended formally in 1943 because Britain, the US, France, and Japan, although at war with each other, renounced extrality and renounced their claims to the foreign concessions in China, which at that point, of course, were occupied by Japan. And within a few years of the end of the war, the communists defeated the nationalists in the Civil War, which resumed in late 45, early 46, and the nationalist regime basically retreated to Taiwan. So by 1950, there were two entities claiming to be the legitimate government of China. And I like this poster because it reaffirms that the People's Republic of China constitutes the only legitimate government of all the People's Republic of China, in case you missed that memo. This is, I love these posters from this point because they're so graphically interesting, but also they're really a snapshot of the moment. And the two entities claiming to be the legitimate government of China, one of the ways they did this was by appealing to the overseas Chinese living outside of China. And these people, for the next 2.5 decades, played something of a significant role in the competition between the PRC and the ROC, the Republic of China, on Taiwan. And I say a significant role in both regimes. It was a different role, but overseas Chinese remittances, sending money to families in China, and donations, often donating to schools or institutions in China or on Taiwan. These were valuable sources of foreign currency for both regimes, and both regimes counted on them, depended on them at various times. Both regimes, to different degrees, saw the overseas Chinese outside of China as politically useful in terms of lobbying the governments of the countries in which they lived, both for recognition of whatever regime and also for potential entry into the United Nations. And the nationalists in particular viewed the support of the overseas Chinese as legitimizing their claims to be the lawful government of China. They might not actually control the territory of China any longer, they argued, but they controlled the loyalties of the people who were preserving Chinese tradition overseas. And so I start here with a 1950 poster, but this is actually from 1972. I said this goes on for decades. This is actually a Taiwan-affiliated overseas Chinese assemblage claiming to speak for all ethnic Chinese abroad. It's an advertisement from the New York Times opposing the admission of the PRC to the United Nations. And there were a number of these all through the 70s, each year it seemed. So the nationalists in Taiwan try to use the overseas Chinese to continue to legitimize their claim that they are the legitimate ruler of China, even though they are no longer in control of the Chinese territory. But the communist government, as they consolidated their hold on power on the mainland by the early 1950s, they also saw the issue of foreign-born ethnic Chinese citizenship as offering a valuable opportunity for the PRC to legitimize the communist government internationally. This is an ongoing tug of war. And I say this because the pre-war nationalist regime had argued about citizenship status of foreign-born ethnic Chinese with colonial rulers like Britain and Holland. In contrast, the People's Republic of China by the early 50s was operating in a totally different world, dealing with newly independent countries in Southeast Asia that were themselves trying to establish what membership in their respective nations meant and required. So in handling the citizenship question, the PRC used the opportunity to enhance its legitimacy in direct contrast to Taiwan. Taiwan continued to emphasize the old yes sanguinis policies, by demanding the loyalty of ethnic Chinese citizens, not just in Taiwan, but outside its borders, in places like the Philippines and Malaya, New York City, among other places. I've written a book about this. This often happened to the detriment in Southeast Asia of the interest and safety of the ethnic Chinese so claimed. In contrast, outside of China, the PRC encouraged ethnic Chinese to denationalize or denaturalize and shift their loyalties to their countries of residence, as long as they didn't shift them to the Kuomintang or the Republic of China. Meanwhile, the problems that Yu-sanguinis versus Yu-solhi citizenship had caused before the war pretty much went away inside of China after the war, after 1949 in particular. I mentioned extrality had ended for everybody, whatever their ethnicity. The ROC, the Republic of China, maintained its Yu-sanguinis law, but had no room or desire to allow in anybody but carefully chosen delegations of overseas Chinese leaders who came to Taiwan for brief visits. Frankly, second-generation ethnic Chinese born abroad were not trying to get into Taiwan anyway, in significant numbers. Those who lived in the United States and Canada, and eventually elsewhere, slowly began to enjoy more opportunities in their birth nations, even as racism continued to limit their horizons. It did not limit them the way it had before the war. Either way, the policy of the United States to isolate the People's Republic of China and support the Republic of China on Taiwan and to pressure its allies to do the same during the Cold War meant a shift in the kinds of foreign-born overseas Chinese able to move to China or even just to visit. Overall, almost no American, Canadian, or Australian-born Chinese moved to China after the Korean War. It was almost impossible. And those few who actually did largely avoided discussion of their foreign roots and connections, since inside the PRC, especially at politically tricky times, such ties often made them seem suspicious. And even many Southeast Asian-born ethnic Chinese had little interest in the end in studying or living in China, despite PRC claims that it was the true magnet for the patriotic overseas Chinese. All of these developments simplified the formerly complex issue of the status of foreign-born ethnic Chinese inside of China, especially for the ethnic Chinese from the nations that had once enjoyed extrality in China. So after the death of Mao and the eventual emergence of Deng Xiaoping as China's leader, the reform and opening policies included continuing to encourage foreign-born ethnic Chinese to transfer their loyalties from China, if they still had them, to their nations of birth and residence, for much the same purpose as the PRC policy had been that in the 1950s. China was seeking to change its international image from exporter of revolution and proponent of erratic radicalism to good and peaceful neighbor and exporter of consumer goods. By enhancing its image as a stable nation, the PRC, of course, also sought to encourage overseas Chinese to invest in China, especially in this new special economic zones. Shenzhen was built right next to Hong Kong for a reason. And to make it possible for overseas Chinese to claim loyalties to their place of birth and residence, but to invest in China. Eventually, China also took a more lenient approach to emigration, and hundreds of thousands of Chinese from the mainland began to go abroad, to leave. Many left and established residences abroad, naturalized, and had children who are foreign citizens. And that has all happened since the 1980s. And this, of course, was mostly felt outside of China's borders. But China's rapid economic development in the past 2 decades has increasingly attracted a growing number of ethnic Chinese born abroad, especially in the US, Canada, and Australia, to move to China for work. Some are the children of immigrants who left for Hong Kong before the 1997 handover. Others are the children of China-born students or labor migrants who left China in the 1980s and 90s. Still others come from families that have lived outside of China for 4 or 5 generations or more. Whatever their origins, thousands have sought jobs in booming China, especially since the 1990s. This is certainly not the same as it was 100 years ago. The push for these new economic migrants to China isn't actually ferocious racism, which has diminished substantially in the sending countries, nor is it the desire to build China into a strong and modern nation, which it basically already is. Instead, foreign-born ethnic Chinese, like their non-Chinese peers, have sought job opportunities of the type that have become available for well-educated Westerners in China's booming economy, especially if they speak Chinese, but not necessarily. Not only are the migrants' motives not the same as they were 100 years ago, but the attitude of their birth countries is also very different. Today, these nations, including Canada, Australia, and the United States, recognize and protect the citizenship of these ethnic Chinese citizens, unlike 100 years ago when, for example, U.S. consuls, as I talked about, were more than happy to wash their hands of Chinese American citizens who got into trouble in China and actively looked for excuses to do so. Or the British Foreign Office, which routinely complained that the Colonial Office and the governments of the Strait Settlements, Singapore and Hong Kong, forced them to help Anglo-Chinese in China, but they thought it was a worthless task. Today, these nations actually do actively protect these citizens. But the reason we are increasingly aware of the degree to which these nations recognize and attempt to protect their citizens in China is that over the past 6 to 7 years, we've started to see instances, including the ones I mentioned at the outset, of ways in which the PRC government appears to be fudging its own citizenship policies, treating foreign-born ethnic Chinese as quasi-Chinese citizens, and using exit bans in particular against ethnic Chinese with foreign citizenship, including those born abroad. In other words, Chinese officials do appear to be sort of asserting a shadow jus sanguinis at times, denying the citizenship status of foreign-born ethnic Chinese and Chinese naturalized abroad, despite the 1980 naturalization law and the PRC's non-recognition of dual citizenship. So what is actually happening here beyond the surface similarities? Very few scholars have looked at the treatment of foreign-born ethnic Chinese in China today, focusing instead at growing PRC attempts to influence ethnic Chinese abroad, including not just former Chinese citizens, but people whose families have lived outside of China for generations. In other words, a sort of more recent sense that there's a very large Chinese diaspora of millions that the PRC government wants to influence in some way. Scholars have described these attempts at influence as occurring especially in Australia and Canada, but also the United States, as well as in places like Singapore and other parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. These accelerated overt and covert attempts at influence over the past few years essentially reflect Xi Jinping's emphasis, and President Xi Jinping of China, his emphasis on the importance of what he calls united front work. This is a very old term in the PRC, but he has emphasized united front work among overseas Chinese in particular. And this has involved in recent years not just the obvious, like Confucius Institutes and government-sponsored trips to China for ethnic Chinese youth from abroad, something the ROC government also has done. But less obvious means, like attempts to influence the independent Chinese language media outside of China, as well as to influence politicians and domestic politics in places like Canada and Australia. And this emphasis on united front work among millions of overseas Chinese, whatever their citizenship or background, reflects Xi Jinping's very expansive view of his so-called China Dream ideology, which he rolled out in 2012. And at this time, he contended that, quote, the realization of the China Dream is the ultimate vision of China's sons and daughters within the country and overseas, unquote. That's a pretty broad terminology to use, and it was not a slip of the tongue, but one widely repeated and amplified by Xi Jinping and other officials and Chinese consuls in the years since. As the scholar Leo Surya Donata has pointed out, quote, in the past, Huaqiao and Huaren have been widely used to distinguish China's citizens overseas and foreign citizens of Chinese descent. The 1980 citizenship law, in fact, stresses this distinction, and the law remains unamended. However, in recent practice, the terms have been used together, and Haiwai Huaren, meaning Chinese overseas, is often replaced with Haiwai Qiaobao, overseas compatriots, in the PRC's leaders' speeches. There's a qualitative difference here. It seems semantic, but it's clearly reminiscent in some ways of the possessive attitude that Chinese leaders in the nationalist period expressed towards all ethnic Chinese wherever born. Within China, the shift from Huaren to Qiaobao has been accompanied by a growing tendency of officials to see foreign citizen Chinese as assets for their skills and education, but also as potentially disruptive to social stability. The first part of that equation, the asset part, is obvious in the Ministry of Public Security's recent introduction of a special 5-year visa for foreign citizens of Chinese ancestry. And actually, here's a China Daily story about this. And I like I liked it because the headline expresses the slippage between people who have recent roots in China, naturalized citizens or the children of them, and the idea that home for all ethnic Chinese is China, no matter how many generations removed. So this special 5-year visa allows foreign citizens of Chinese ancestry multiple entries and exits. The Ministry of Public Security defines those eligible for this special visa as, quote, individuals with at least one parent, grandparent, or ancestor who is or was a Chinese citizen, unquote. Since the nationalist definition of Chinese citizenship operated until at least the late 40s, this definition covers every person of Chinese ethnicity in the world. And for that reason, it's far more ambitious than a simple attempt to stop a brain drain and lure back China-born people who have naturalized abroad. It's also aimed at ethnic Chinese whose families haven't lived in China for generations. These new visas were introduced despite concerns that ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia voiced about the way the visas, like the slippage of language, could affect people of Chinese background in places like Malaysia and Indonesia, places with histories of anti-Chinese violence around these issues. Inside of China, though, such language hints that one way to contain potentially socially disruptive Huarren while harnessing their skills is to find a way to make them subject to PRC authority without the threat of foreign consular interference, to view and treat them as Qiaobao rather than Huarren, in other words. Although forcing, for instance, ethnic Chinese foreigners to travel as Chinese nationalists is a break with the PRC's own stated policies on overseas Chinese nationality, so are the words the leadership now uses in the slippage of language. And for that reason, foreign governments have started to pay attention. And I mentioned the Canadian government now warns travelers that, quote, if you are a Canadian of Chinese origin traveling to China, ensure that you are well informed about Chinese law and practices relating to determination and loss of Chinese citizenship, including applying to renounce Chinese citizenship, unquote. An interesting thing to say that given the nationality law today stipulates the automatic loss of Chinese citizenship upon naturalization elsewhere and supposedly doesn't require ethnic Chinese who naturalize abroad to go through a major process. And also that nationality law specifically doesn't grant Chinese citizenship to ethnic Chinese born abroad to families who have settled abroad. It's very specific about that. In other words, the PRC under Xi Jinping is increasingly asserting a possessive attitude towards foreign citizenship, ethnic Chinese in China that not only smacks of the nationalist approach, but is at odds with the PRC's own stated laws. Now, to go back in time a little, in the 1920s and afterwards, the Kuomintang attempted to prove its legitimacy to ethnic Chinese abroad and to influence them through overseas Chinese education initiatives and attempts to control the Chinese language press abroad. This larger purpose was to benefit the Kuomintang's consolidation of power and to encourage ethnic Chinese abroad to donate to the government and invest in industry to modernize the nation. Simultaneously, inside China, the nationalists viewed foreign-born ethnic Chinese as people with potentially valuable skills, yet whose presence was potentially destabilizing. The Kuomintang viewed many of these people as pernicious agents of decadent Western individualism and values like democracy that could threaten the regime. Perhaps this sounds a little familiar. Yet a key difference is that in the 20s, the nationalists were trying to achieve two aims by claiming authority over men like Chu Xiao-y and Nick Char. First, they were trying to find ways to chip away at extrality and reassert their sovereignty in the face of the foreign powers' attempts to preserve extrality. But at the same time, they were attempting to do so in a way that overtly conformed to international law. Because under international law, again, dual citizens living in one of their two countries were under the authority of that country. The nationalists wanted, in other words, to show their compliance with international law, to prove that there was no need for extrality because their government respected international law, and this would help them undermine foreign dominance in China and gain complete sovereignty over their own territory. The PRC's motivations, thus, are quite different, for it already exercises sovereignty in its own territory. This is not history repeating itself, in other words. It's the story of two very different regimes operating in very different contexts, but drawing on the shared language about overseas compatriots' assumed ties to the motherland in order to use these people to achieve the nation's goals. we've seen this, actually, this kind of rectification and deployment of other shared symbols of the past as well, from the rediscovery of Confucianism in order to encourage social stability, to the belated recognition of nationalist soldiers' participation and heroism in the war against Japan by mainland officials, to encourage reunification with Taiwan by emphasizing shared Chineseness. While the nationalist aggressive jus sanguinis represented that regime's weakness, the PRC's shadow jus sanguinis signals the opposite. The linguistic slippages to reclaim all ethnic Chinese, and even the exit bans applied especially to ethnic Chinese, suggest the PRC government's confidence that its military and particularly its economic dominance allow it to disregard international law and even its own law when those things get in the way of other goals and interests. And oddly enough, this slippage has actually, in some ways, touched my own research and work. I'm going to finish with that. About 4 years ago, I presented some of my findings at a talk at the Museum of Chinese in America. It was a talk about Chinese American citizens who were going to work or study in Republican China. And a handful of reporters from the Chinese and Chinese language press covered my talk. I was amused to be interviewed in turn by the Taiwan-oriented World Journal and then by the PRC-oriented China Daily. A few days later, I read, to my astonishment, this article in China Daily. And I say I was rather astonished because it contained about 50 factually incorrect statements, among them that I had come back from China with 3,000 pages of archival research, which anybody who's done research in China recently knows that's not gonna happen. You're lucky to get a third of a file over a week's time. So that was a reference to the National Archives in the US. But what I thought was particularly interesting about this is not only the headline, Chinese Americans who went home. So again, that language of China as the automatic sort of home for all ethnic Chinese. But the fact that one of the final things the reporter said was, quote, "The nicest thing about doing the research," she said, me being she, "is helping Chinese Americans understand more about their motherland," unquote. One of several instances of using the term motherland in this article. I can tell you, I don't think I've ever used the word motherland to speak to anybody. And when I've used it in my book, it's in quotes. I use it very, very, sparingly to quote others. The idea of return and home and motherland just sort of kind of creeps in here in a way that was quite astonishing to me, but I didn't really notice as much in 2015 as I noticed preparing for my talk and realizing that it's sort of affecting a lot of areas of the way that ethnic Chinese abroad are understood. Thank you.